Hello everyone. Today we are going to go over another endgame, and this game is from composer Frank Teed, who was born in 1859 and died in 1929. Now, Frank Teed was an editor for the Columbia Chess Chronicle, and he was a pretty strong player in his day. He defeated former world champion Wilhelm Steinitz um, +1 in one draw in a casual two-game match back in 1883. And although he was born in 1856, he didn't learn chess until 1871. So he became a strong player, although he started relatively late, especially by today's standards. His most notable result is winning the Marshall Chess Club Championship in 1881. So this position here is relatively simple. Uh, this position that he composed, there are some traps here, but I'm using it to illustrate some principles that you can take and apply in your games. So it's not really about just trying to just solve the problem, but it's taking and extracting the principles out of the position. So what's going on here? First of all, it's white to move, and most of you out there who are pretty strong, at least above 1800 or so, can already see that white should play the move King F7 here. Right? That's pretty obvious, taking the opposition. But I want to go back and let's discuss the position a little more. So we have two um, issues here, right? If we look at the board and we ask ourselves, what is white's greatest advantage here? We would say that white has space, right? Overwhelming amount of space, right? But what does that really mean? Um, is it meaningful that white can get his king to A8 faster than black, or his king to A1? Yes, he has all this space, but is that really important? And I want to argue no. And the point is that we have to recognize the important real estate on the board. Just space is too generic of a term for us to really get any meaning out of it, right? We need to have the space on the board that is important to us, so we need to identify where that is. So in this position, the space is where the material is, right, on the G and H files, right? So now that we know that, now we can get more specific. And the space that we need here is G6, G7, and G8, right? If we're white, because at the end of the day, we need to promote a pawn to win the game, right? There's no pieces on the board, so we can't checkmate the black king any other way but by promotion. Therefore, two things come to mind. First, we must control these three critical squares, G6, G7, and G8. Second, we must preserve material, so we can't allow the pawns to be traded off, because that would lead in the draw. So once you understand these two main objectives, this will allow you to find the moves and solve this position. All right. So why is King F7 important? Well, King F7 is important because with this move we gain the opposition. All right. So for you newer players out there, I'm going to define the opposition in chess for you. So opposition takes place when two kings face each other, right, on the rank, file, or diagonal. The key point to remember is that there must be an odd number of spaces between them. So, for instance, in this position you see right now, there's only one square in between, right? So it can be one square, three squares, or five. So, for example, here, white does not have the opposition because there are two squares in between kings. Here, white does have the opposition, as there's one square. Here, there's three squares, so that's an odd number. Again, white has the opposition. And also, with five squares in between, white also has the opposition. All right. Now, the opposition is important because the player that has the opposition, so in this case, white, after king f7, forces the other players to have to move his king out of the way. So if we're here and we go to f7, and let's say the pawns couldn't move, this king is forced to move. So the player that can move is said to hold the opposition. So when I play king f7 here, I have the opposition against black, right? And that's, of course, if these pawns can't move or they were just off the board. So opposition is very important because it forces the opponent to have to move, and most times it's to a square where he doesn't want to move, right? So it's bad in chess when you're forced by your opponent to have to do something, right? That's a bad sign. That means something is definitely wrong with your position when your opponent is dictating terms to you. All right, so now that I've explained opposition, now we can look at a variation. So, for example, instead of king f7, some of you might be wondering, well, what's wrong with king f6, right? Doesn't it do the same thing? It completes our objectives of controlling these squares on the G file, G6, G7, and G8, right? And it also preserves material. What can be wrong? Well, let's see. So after king f6, black, of course, again, does not want to give up control of these squares on the G file. So he plays h5. Notice he does not give up the control of this real estate. And let's say G takes h5. Then black simply plays king h6. And this is going to lead to a draw. All right, because there's no way that white is able to conserve material. All right, black simply walks down the h file and picks up both pawns. Okay, so what we have here in this variation is white is able to control the critical squares, but he loses material. And remember, at the beginning, I said there were two objectives. You had to control the squares and keep the material on the board. So the fundamental error with this move is that you only complete one of the objectives. You control, but you lose material. So again, after king f6, h5, another variations, king takes g5, h takes g4, h takes g4, and now king g7. This is also a draw. And the same reason, but in this case, white preserves material but loses control over the critical squares G6, G7, and G8. Notice that the position of the black king prevents white from making progress. So now he has the pawn, but he doesn't have the control. And that's what's wrong with the move king f6. So those are just two interesting sidelines illustrating the problem that white faces here. So in one variation, again, he loses the material, but he has the control. Let's just say that. And I just played that out so you can see. And then the other variation, he loses the control over the position, but he preserves the material. So you need both elements. Again, here's the other line, and this is the opposition that I'm talking about. So here, the black king takes opposition. After king g7, the white king is forced to move as there are no other legal moves on the board. The white king is forced to move. And so maybe king f5 or king h5, and all you have to do if you're black is just keep following the king. And there's no way that a white can make progress. All right. Again, just simple rules of chess here in maintaining opposition. So this is why king f6 is no good. So now that you understand that, king f7 is the first move we need to make here. So we gain opposition here. Now, black has a way out because remember, the pawns are not completely fixed. He still can move this h-pawn. So although white is attempting to gain opposition here, black is not exactly forced to move his king. If he was forced to move his king, the game would be over. So for example, if black moved to h8, this is obviously an error. Why? Because he loses control over critical squares. So white just brings his king to g6 and say after g8, king takes, king f7, king takes g5, and what we see here is white gaining the material, and this is too much material. Now he's just up 2 pawns. So although black is able to gain the opposition, it's only temporary, and the reason is because white has this mobile h-pawn, and there is nothing that black can do to maintain the opposition. So he just plays h4, and now the opposition switches because black's king is now forced to move, king f7, and then here is where the takeover of real estate happens. King h6, king f8. It doesn't matter if he plays king to g8. If king g8, there's all types of moves that can be played here, but king g6 is the most human. And again, the black king is forced. And this is why king h8 is not an option. So gaining the opposition is good, but here black is now forced to give it up. And remember, black has the same objectives. He wants to keep control of this real estate here, g6, g7, and g8. So what does he do here? He plays this move h5, setting up traps in the position. Okay, he's trying to maintain the control over those squares at all costs. h5. So what does what does white have to play here? Again, if he plays king f6, notice he's giving up the opposition because black is taking the opposition or is challenging here. If he plays king f6 here, let's see what happens. So white gives up the opposition. So h takes g4, h takes g4, king h6. Now black has the opposition. King f5, king h7, exclamation mark. Now if you know your endgames, you will understand why this move is good. King takes g5, king g7. Notice once again white cannot control the critical squares. So we're in an analogous position like I showed you before, where white has the material, but he doesn't control the real estate. So he cannot win. Again, after king f6, I'll just show you if black doesn't know what he's doing. So again, the key move here is king h7 with the idea of taking the opposition. If black doesn't know what he's doing in the endgame and plays king g7, now it's white who takes over the opposition. So king takes g5. Now black is forced to move his king, and now everything falls in place for white. as he controls the critical squares and he has the material. And you can see the king just marches, the pawn just marches up the board rather. All right, but with correct play, black will be able to draw comfortably. So king f6 is not a solution. And if g takes h5, same problem here. We see that again material is lost, and so the space advantage doesn't matter without the pawns on the board. Here's the critical move, h4. Again, putting the ball back in black's court here. And now finally black capitulates and he gives up the opposition here. If he plays h takes g4 for instance, white just plays h takes g5 and you can see both criteria fulfilled, control and material, as the pawn would just race up the board. If he took the other way with the g pawn, then the same thing. So it doesn't matter which pawn black captures with. Two criteria are fulfilled by white and he will win. This is why after h4, black finally has to concede opposition here and play king h6. Now what does white play? Can he finally capture? No, he cannot. Because again, if he's greedy and plays h takes g5 here, check, then just simply king takes g5. G takes. Again, what do we have here? White has the control, but there's no material. So that's a dead draw. So after king h6, white must take the opposition again. Now finally, black is forced to make a capture. So he's still trying to hold on to these critical squares, g6, g7, g8, and he's forced to capture here. So he plays g takes h4. If king h7, then he just loses. After h takes g4, excuse me, h takes g5, h takes g4, and then king f7, and then you have the same situation. Then it just becomes a race. And white wins. So after g takes h4 by black, now we have g5, king h7, king f7, and here you should be able to see that it's a clear win for white as both criteria have been fulfilled, right? He has the control over the critical squares and he has the material preserved, right? All you need is one pawn to win. And this is how the study ends up. So what's the conclusion here? The conclusion here is in these type of situations, in these endgames, you identify the critical space which needs to be controlled. It's not enough just to be general in your approach and say, well, I have the space advantage. All right, you have to identify the important real estate. All right, like they say in the real estate world, location, location, location. So it's the same thing. You can't just say I have a space advantage. You have to figure out exactly where you need to concentrate your energy in the position. In this case, it was G6, G7, and G8. All right. So that's step one. Two, preserve material. Okay. Because the weaker side needs to get rid of all of the pawns so that he can draw. So you know you need to preserve at least one pawn. All right. In order to win the game. So that's step two. And moving on to step three is you want to pay close attention to the opposition. All right, especially as the pawns are relatively fixed. All right, because if you lose opposition, the opponent is able to draw the game because you're not able to control the critical squares. So remember, you need material and the critical space. So the opposition deals with the control aspect. If you lose the opposition, you lose control. All right. And um, finally, remember Capablanca's old adage long time ago, position over material. And we can modify that and say control over material. So don't get greedy. You already have an advantage. Make sure that above all you maintain control over the position. All right. If you get greedy and go after material, then many times you'll blow positions that you should win. All right. So remember, control is the most important. So that's it for this end game. I hope it was instructive for you. I look forward to seeing your comments below. And if there's any other end game questions that you have, let me know. And please check the links in the box below where I will attach some DVDs related to what we just discussed. And also, please donate to my channel if this video has been any assistance of you. And I will see you guys soon on the next video.